זה עובד? לא עובד. עובד? Okay. Good morning. Thank you very much for the introduction, my good friend Yitzchak. We've been on a lot of things together. I am still not a hostage of the computers. Like, I can still talk without the computers. Efforts at delegitimization of Israel clearly constitutes a security threat for Israel. The President of the United States, President Obama, in a speech at AIPAC on April 22nd, 2011, not this year, the previous year, said the proof of our commitment to the security of the State of Israel is our total opposition to all and any attempts at delegitimizing the State of Israel. So if the President of the United States views delegitimization, efforts, attempts at delegitimization of the State of Israel as indeed a threat, then evidently this is something that should be viewed as one of many security threats that we face and for which we must find a proper answer. At the same time, I think it is always important, the first step, and my good friend Gerald, who helped me very, very much in an article that I wrote on delegitimization, I would venture to say he's probably the number one expert that we have in this field, gave me a number of, spoke now about a number of ways to combat the delegitimization effort, which is worldwide, all-encompassing. And we just had an example of the amount of funds that are put into it. But I think a first step in dealing with this threat is, first of all, to properly evaluate it. And just as there is always a danger of under-evaluating a threat, most people are not aware that there is also a danger many times of over-evaluating a threat. Because an over-evaluating a threat leads to over-allocation of resources to deal with the threat. And over-allocation of sources to one area, of course, leads to an under-allocation of resources to another area. So it's very important, I think, to try to view in proper proportion, realizing that we face one of many security threats. Perhaps it is not as dangerous, or certainly it's not as dangerous as the Iranian threat, which is a severe threat to Israel's vital security, but it is a threat in the long run, certainly for Israel's security, but at the same time, we have to try to analyze properly what are the dimensions of the threat, where is it more serious, where is it less serious, etc. If I had more time, if I had a lecture for an hour and a half, I would start, as one should in an academic setting, such as this very important Netanya Academic College, an academic institution, a research institution, of trying to define what delegitimization is. Because, of course, one can argue where is the line between delegitimization and acceptable criticism of actions of Israeli government, of the IDF, etc. I don't want to go into this area and trying to define it. To a certain degree, I can say it's like the Supreme Court of the United States have said about pornography. It's hard to define it. When you see it, you know it's it. So to a certain degree, we can say the same thing. It's hard to define it. Anatol Sharansky, who spoke before us here, he wrote and tried, he gave the 3D criteria for delegitimization, the famous 3D. Demonization of Israel. Net delegitimization, in other words, denial of the very right of the Jewish people to establish a nation state in the land of Israel, and double standard, the 3Ds. But of course, again, it's not so easy to decide when is it the double standard, when isn't it, when is it criticism that becomes demonization, etc. So there's a problem in defining delegitimization, which again is important because, and I think that Gerald mentioned this correctly so on the last point that he made, we have to differentiate between delegitimization, which is illegitimate, and between problems, violations of human rights, which occur and may occur. We're dealing with human beings, may occur also in Israel. And if we try to put everything within the context of delegitimization, we're going to harm the struggle against delegitimization. So definition is important, but I won't go into it now. What I want to mainly concentrate on is try to evaluate what really is the effects of delegitimization and where should we concentrate and how on trying to meet this threat and find what we call in Hebrew hama'aneh, the answer in the terms of IDF parlance, which I'm used to. It's a ma'aneh, the answer to this threat. I think that the delegitimization effort mainly works in three arms. Three arms. Is that it? Okay. The first, I would say, is in the area of public diplomacy, what's called today public diplomacy. In the old times, before we had all the fancy terms, we used to call it hasbara, information. But now we don't speak about hasbara anymore. We say public diplomacy. In other words, the image of Israel as a democratic, free, peace-loving state which respects human rights, respects international law, and respects the accepted code of moral conduct as any state should do. The image of Israel is very, very important. This is an important area because naturally there's a correlation between international support and from the very days of the early days of the State of Israel, in fact, even before the creation of the State of Israel, the three great goals that David Ben Meir set for Israeli foreign policy, as was mentioned here as for a number of years Deputy Foreign Minister, remain the same goals. To guarantee, of course, what we called then in those days, Koach HaMagen HaIvri. Today we call to guarantee the strength of the IDF to defend Israel, to try to break up the belligerent coalition of Arab states against us and try to reach peace with as many states as we can, and to guarantee international support for the legitimate aspirations of the Jewish people then, before the creation of the State of Israel, the fight for partition, etc. And today we would say to guarantee international support for the legitimate aspiration and the legitimate interests of the State of Israel, a key issue. So one arm is the effect it has on the image of the State of Israel. The second arm, I would say, of this all-encompassing effect, that delegitimization of Israel, which is organized, some of it less organized, some of it more organized, but there is a mind behind it, is the practical area which is normally called BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions. And the third arm, mainly, I would say, is the arm which is normally called in the term lawfare, trying to use international law, which is very much developed in the past decades, and institutions of international law, the ICC I'll come back to right away, as venues in which Israel can be attacked and which Israel's interests can be damaged, etc. In my opinion, the major area where the threat is greatest is in the first area of public diplomacy. And I'll come back to it later because I want to concentrate on it. The area of BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, to boycott Israel, to boycott Israeli actors. I just read today in the paper there's a controversy regarding Habima performance in the London celebration of that whole article in The Guardian. Well, what can you expect from The Guardian? A letter written in The Guardian against permitting Habima to perform in London. There was a counter letter today. And, of course, economic boycott, divestment from Israeli companies, not buying Israeli products, etc. And the third is the lawfare. I think they said the BDS effort is something, again, we should not minimize it. But in my opinion, overall, and I'll be careful at what we say in the Hebrew, we say nachon layom, correct to today, to 11:15 this morning, I think that this effort has minimal results. Minimal results. And I've researched this extensively. Gerald maybe can know better, but I think he agrees with me, minimal results. There may be some successes for the BDS efforts on the micro level, micro. You can speak to some Israeli industrialists, they say here and there, we may have a problem. I'm speaking to someone I want to export, etc., and I see that he's a little hesitant, maybe he'll have a problem, etc. And the macro, we don't have a problem. And the numbers speak for themselves. Israel's economy the growth is at a rate which is higher than almost all OECD countries, certainly higher than the average OECD. Israeli exports continue to grow. Israel has a positive balance of payments. Last year we had over 3 million tourists, a record number of tourists coming to Israel, etc. We do not see in the macro, in the numbers, any significant really effect, I say correct to today, it may change, of the whole BDS efforts. Tremendous efforts were made against Caterpillar, not to sell various things to Israel, failed. Caterpillar continues its relations with Israel and sells Israel machines, etc., etc. I think, if what I read is correctly, that even the efforts, Gerald again related to it, the efforts at Apartheid Week in campuses, etc., this year was less successful than previous years. So the BDS, I think, is something which, as time goes on, it takes time sometimes to get your forces ready to counterattack. But I think, as I said yesterday in an interview to Reuven in Galei Tzahal, I think that as time going on, Israel is more and more adept at trying to organize counter efforts to the BDS, which are more or less successful. The second area, lawfare, I think is a little more dangerous. At the moment, it has not been successful. At the moment, I think there are almost nil success of the efforts at lawfare, but I do not think we should be complacent in this area. And here I would like to differ with Gerald in one point. The decision of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court just a few days ago, in which he rejected, after over a year and a half of consideration and all the efforts that Gerald mentioned in favor of it, he rejected the application of the Palestinian Authority to be recognized as a state, because if she would be recognized, if this authority would be recognized as a state, it could then lodge complaints against Israelis, not Israel, against Israelis, army officers, political leaders, in the ICC regarding acts that they would claim, of course, would be war crimes in its area, in other words, the West Bank or Gaza. But if you read very carefully the decision of the prosecutor, we should not be complacent, as Gerald, I see, smiles and says, because what did the prosecutor say? The prosecutor said, today, I am not recognizing the Palestinian Authority as not a state because its status at the UN is that of an observer. But, he said, if the General Assembly will adopt a resolution granting the Palestinian Authority, or Palestine, granting it status as a non-member state, such as the Vatican, for instance, then they might very well qualify as a state. Even if they qualify as a state, it doesn't mean that the ICC will be able to deal with their complaints, because according to the treaty of the ICC, any country which has its own internal process of investigation and proper judgment, etc., is not subject to the ICC. The ICC is subject to Sudan or Syria, where we know what the due process of law is in those countries. So I believe that even if they'll be recognized as a state, we have a good case that there is no jurisdiction for the ICC. But as I just wanted to say, this problem is something which lies in the future and which must be dealt with. And I would like to say, to the credit of the IDF, as in many areas, the IDF is the chalutz lifnei hamachaneh, deals with, before the civilian institutions get themselves organized to deal with this. The IDF realized the danger, and the IDF has taken major steps. It has appointed legal consultants at the brigade level and eventually even at the battalion level in order to advise and to help the commander. The decision is that of the commander, according to international law. The decision is that of the commander, but to help him in dealing with potential threats. But the final area, of 2-3 more minutes, the final area I think which is the most dangerous one is the area, Gerald, is the area of public diplomacy. And why do I think this is the area? Because, again, as I say, Israel's image in public opinion In the democracies, you know, every politician knows that he needs a base, right? Bibi Netanyahu always speaks about his base, the right. The Republicans now are concerned of organizing their base to support their candidate, etc. Israel also has a base. Our base is the support of the democratic, free Western world. It is with that support that the State of Israel was created. It was first and foremost, of course, of the United States, but not only of the United States. And it is that support which has helped Israel today. And we should not always see the negative side, the negative part of the balance sheet. We have tremendous areas of support for Israel throughout the world, in every country, even in Scandinavia, even in Europe, etc., even in the difficult countries, Spain and Norway, etc. There are people, I've met them in my position in public life, and it is sometimes heartwarming when you see people who are devoted with their whole life and heart to defend the interests of Israel and of the Jewish people. So this is our base. We must preserve our base. This delegitimization, pictures such as we saw last night and you mentioned it, cause harm. And that harm, each specific incident in itself, of course, is not going to decide the issue. But the cumulative effect can cause harm. And what is great concern to me, I mentioned this yesterday to Reuven, is the concluding point I will say, one more point concluding, I think is a great deal of concern for me when I view the situation overall, is the gap that exists in Europe, not in the United States. The United States situation is much better. But in the Western European countries, Britain, France, Germany, and other EU countries. And the EU is our major trading partner, and we have, I don't want to go into the whole story of the relations of the EU and how important it is for us, etc. You see a gap between the official positions of the governments, which are more or less, I would say, either pro-Israel or at least understanding of Israel, and public opinion. And again, if you take the major states, Britain, France, Germany, these governments, until now at least, again, we have differences of opinion with them, have differences of opinion with President Obama too. But these governments more or less support Israel. First of all, at the government level, they oppose the BDS. Correct, Gerald? The governments of all these countries oppose the BDS. And they say we are against boycott, or against academic boycott, or against economic boycott, etc. And in most institutions, either they will support Israel, maybe they'll abstain on a certain vote. They will not support radical anti-Israeli resolutions, etc. So more or less, and we have good relations with those governments, and we have intelligence cooperation, we have security relations with them. But when you look at the public opinion polls, and I say to the credit of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Misrad HaChutz, both we worked for Misrad HaChutz at one time. Misrad HaChutz is putting more and more effort, more and more money to trying to see what public opinion is in these countries. The story is not good. In the United States, support for Israel versus Palestinians is 3-1 or 4-1. In Britain, I'm not talking about Spain or Scandinavia or difficult countries, but even the three basic, let's say the hard countries, Britain, France, Germany, the main major countries of the EU, when you ask the public of people whether you support Israel or Palestinians, you have more supporting Palestinians than Israel. More people say the Palestinians are right rather than the Israelis. You have severe images of Israel which are negative. And as this gap grows, we're dealing with democratic countries, and those governments, of course, are attuned to the public opinion of their population. These people tomorrow are going to vote in the next elections. And every government wants to be reelected. So they have to pay attention to what their people are thinking. And as this gap can grow, it poses a very great danger. And therefore, we have to organize ourselves, and I will conclude it. I think Gerald said it, and Gerald deals with it much better than me. We must organize a major national effort, coordinated. The key word is coordination. A coordinated effort, because here is involved the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and of course involved the IDF, which is a major target of delegitimization, and involved the Ministry of Finance, and involved the Ministry of Trade and Industry, and involved, of course, the Prime Minister's Bureau, etc. We have to coordinate all the efforts that Israel has, and all the help we can get throughout the world, both from Jewish communities in key countries where there are strong Jewish communities, and their help is already being felt. United States, Canada, Great Britain, maybe France, and other countries where the Jewish community is not so large. But we have Friends of Israel to coordinate a concentrated effort on the field of public diplomacy and to try to guarantee that the image of Israel indeed, although criticism is legitimate, we have to deal with this criticism. There are things we have to correct, but nevertheless to try to see to it that the general picture of Israel as a democracy, as a country who in the final analysis, one can argue on the terms, always wanted to live in peace and wants to live in peace, that this image will be the image that will come across in the countries throughout Europe so as to strengthen the pro-Israel position also of their governments. Thank you very much.